On the night of our 5th wedding anniversary, my father-in-law intentionally poured a full glass of red wine all over my silk dress in front of 500 elite guests. He grabbed the microphone and announced to the entire ballroom that I was nothing but a cheap waitress from the slums who would never belong in their high society world. When I took the microphone back and exposed his biggest financial secret to the crowd, my husband charged the stage and slapped me so hard I tasted blood. He screamed at me to pack my bags and get out. I simply wiped my face, pulled out my phone, and made one call to the man he thought was just a retired public school teacher. I had no idea my revenge would start before the night was even over. My name is Melody. I am 33 years old, and for 5 years I played the role of a quiet freelance data analyst because I wanted a marriage based on love, not my family wealth. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who severely underestimated your worth. The Waldorf Astoria Ballroom in New York City was dripping with crystal chandeliers and massive arrangements of white orchids. Carter, my husband, was 35 years old and a vice president at a mid-tier investment bank, but he carried himself like he owned Wall Street. We were supposed to be celebrating our anniversary, but Carter had turned the event into a networking gala for his father, Edward. Edward ran a real estate development firm that everyone in their circle believed was wildly successful. He spent the entire evening parading around the room, making sure every politician and hedge fund manager saw his tailored tuxedo. I was standing near the ice sculpture centerpiece wearing a white silk gown I had bought myself, trying to stay out of the way. I knew my in-laws despised me. They constantly reminded me that I came from nothing, that my father was just a retired teacher, and that I should be on my knees thanking Carter for saving me from a life of poverty. Edward approached me with a brimming glass of vintage Cabernet. He did not stumble. He did not slip. He looked me dead in the eyes, tilted his wrist, and let the dark red liquid cascade down the front of my dress. The cold wine soaked through to my skin, instantly ruining the silk. The chatter in the immediate vicinity stopped dead. Edward did not apologize. Instead, he turned his back on me and walked straight to the stage. He grabbed the microphone from the band leader, tapping it loudly until all 500 guests turned their attention to him. "Carter, my boy," Edward boomed through the speakers, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I told you 5 years ago that you cannot turn a stray cat into a show dog. Look at her." He pointed directly at me, shivering in my ruined dress. "I told you that a girl from the slums with a public school teacher for a father would never fit in here. Put her in Italian silk, and she still just looks like a cheap waitress trying to sneak into a party she cannot afford." Laughter erupted from the tables near the stage. Carter's friends, men in expensive suits with inherited money, chuckled into their champagne glasses. Carter stood right next to his father, looking at me with pure embarrassment. He was not embarrassed for what his father had done, but because I was standing there looking like a mess and ruining his perfect image. I did not cry. After 5 years of biting my tongue to keep the peace, after 5 years of watching them flaunt a lifestyle they could barely maintain, the illusion of my patience shattered entirely. I picked up a linen napkin, calmly wiped the worst of the wine from my hands, and walked toward the stage. My heels clicked steadily against the marble floor. The crowd parted, fully expecting me to run out of the double doors in tears. Instead, I walked straight up the steps, stepped right in front of Edward, and pulled the microphone firmly from his hand. "You are right, Edward," I said, my voice projecting crystal clear across the silent ballroom. "I do not fit in here. Because unlike you, I actually pay my own bills." A loud murmur ran through the crowd. Edward's face flushed a deep, angry purple. I turned to face the sea of shocked guests. My father-in-law loves to boast about his luxury estate in the Hamptons. What he forgot to mention to all of you potential investors tonight is that his real estate firm is drowning in hidden debt. The only reason the bank has not foreclosed on that beautiful mansion he loves to show off is because I am the one paying the mortgage. The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Edward lunged forward to grab the microphone back, but I stepped aside. "Every single month, For the past 3 years, I continued my freelance data analyst salary has been covering your massive financial failures, Edward. So before you call me a cheap waitress, maybe you should thank me for keeping a roof over your head. Before I could say another word, Carter charged up the stairs. His face was contorted with absolute rage. He did not yell. He did not argue. He simply drew back his arm and slapped me directly across the face. The impact cracked like a whip through the microphone I was still holding. The force threw me off balance, and I stumbled hard against the grand piano, tasting the sharp metallic tang of blood in my mouth. "How dare you humiliate my family!" Carter screamed, his veins popping in his neck. "Get out of here right now, you useless parasite! Pack your garbage and get out of my house!" From the front row, DeAndre rushed forward. DeAndre was my brother-in-law, married to Carter's sister Brittany. He was a brilliant African-American cardiothoracic surgeon, and the only person in this toxic family who ever treated me with basic human decency. Despite his incredible medical career, Brittany and her parents constantly subjected him to subtle racism and treated him like he was beneath them. He reached the stage, his hands extended to help me up, his eyes blazing with fury at Carter. "Do not even think about it!" DeAndre Brittany shrieked, sprinting after her husband and yanking him back violently by his jacket. "Do not touch that trash. Do you want to humiliate us even more in front of these people? Leave her in the dirt where she belongs." DeAndre shoved Brittany's hand away, looking at his wife and her family with absolute disgust. A silent fracture opened wide between them in that exact moment. I refused DeAndre's help, pushing myself up from the floor. I wiped the blood from my split lip with the back of my hand, smearing it across my skin. The room was dead silent, 500 pairs of eyes watching my every move. I did not look at Carter. I did not look at Edward. I reached into my small clutch, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I had not called for help in over 10 years. It rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Dad," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "Please come. The game is over." Carter let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the tension. He grabbed the microphone I had dropped. "You are calling your daddy." Carter taunted, playing to the crowd again. "What is a retired public school teacher going to do, Melody? Is he going to drive his beat-up Honda down here and mop up the wine for us?" I looked up at Carter, allowing a cold, calculated smile to spread across my face. I held his gaze as the reality of my secret identity finally began to surface. "He is not coming to clean up Carter," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for the entire front row to hear. "He is coming to buy this hotel and throw you out." The tires of my modest sedan crunched against the gravel driveway of the sprawling estate I legally owned, though the man standing on the second-floor balcony currently believed it belonged to him. The cold night air whipped against my face as I stepped out of the car, my silk dress still clinging uncomfortably to my skin from the wine stain. I walked up the stone steps to the heavy mahogany front door and reached for the electronic keypad. I punched in my personal code. A harsh red light blinked on the panel, followed by a sharp, denying beep. I tried again. Another red light. Before I could even process the locked door, a heavy thud echoed behind me. I turned around just in time to see a cheap canvas suitcase hit the manicured lawn. The zipper burst open upon impact, scattering my modest collection of threadbare sweaters and discount department store jeans across the damp grass. A second suitcase came crashing down right next to it, narrowly missing my shoulder. I looked up. Carter was standing on the master bedroom balcony, his tuxedo jacket discarded, leaning over the stone railing with a look of absolute triumph on his face. He sneered down at me, holding up a thick manila envelope before tossing it over the edge. It landed face down on the grass right next to my scattered clothes. "Sign those divorce papers," Carter yelled, his voice echoing through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. "You get absolutely nothing. Do you hear me? I already called the bank and froze every single joint credit card we share. Let us see how long you survive without my banking salary to keep you afloat. You are going to starve, Melody. You are going to be right back in the gutter where my father found you." I stood frozen on the lawn, the chilly wind biting at my exposed shoulders. For 5 years, I had painstakingly curated this wardrobe of cheap clothes. I had driven a used car, I had clipped coupons, and pretended to stress over grocery bills, all to convince this man that I was just a freelance data analyst. I wanted a husband who loved me for my mind and my heart, not a gold digger chasing the Vanguard Holdings fortune. Looking at the cheap cotton shirts littering the grass, I realized the charade was finally over. I did not need to play the role of the struggling wife anymore. I did not say a single word to Carter. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I certainly did not bend down to pick up my clothes. I turned on my heel, walked right back to my car, and drove away, leaving him shouting into the empty night. 20 minutes later, I pulled up to the gleaming entrance of the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Manhattan. The valet hesitated for a fraction of a second when he saw my modest vehicle, but training won out, and he opened my door. I walked into the grand lobby. The space was a cathedral of wealth featuring towering marble pillars, cascading crystal chandeliers, and the soft melody of a grand piano echoing through the room. I knew exactly how I looked. My hair was disheveled. My expensive silk gown was stained a deep, violent purple from Edward's wine, and my lower lip was still slightly swollen from Carter's hand. I approached the front desk. The concierge, a perfectly groomed man with a razor-sharp suit and a judgmental gaze, looked me up and down. His eyes tracked the wine stain, then moved to my battered leather purse. He took a subtle step back, raising a highly manicured hand before I could even speak. "Excuse me, miss," the concierge said, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "This is a private luxury establishment. If you are looking for a public restroom or a place to clean up, there is a diner 2 blocks down the street. I must ask you to leave before I call security." I did not argue. I simply opened my battered purse. I bypassed the frozen joint debit cards and reached deep into the lining, ripping open a hidden silk seam I had sewn shut 5 years ago. I pulled out a solid matte black titanium card. It had no spending limit, no expiration date, and no normal banking logos. It only bore my name and the deeply engraved crest of Vanguard Holdings, the most ruthless and powerful private equity firm in the Western Hemisphere. I placed the heavy metal card flat on the marble counter. The titanium made a sharp, heavy clink that seemed to echo in the quiet space. The concierge stared at it, his brow furrowing in confusion as he tried to identify the crest. But before he could utter another dismissive remark, the general manager of the hotel, who had been crossing the lobby to speak with a guest, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the black card on the counter. The color completely drained from the manager's face. He practically sprinted across the marble floor, roughly shoving his own concierge out of the way to reach the desk. The manager planted his hands on the counter and bowed so deeply his forehead nearly touched the marble. "Miss Melody," the manager gasped, his voice actually trembling with adrenaline and fear. "I am so incredibly sorry for the delay. The presidential suite is instantly available for you. I will have our personal shoppers bring up a completely new designer wardrobe within the hour, and I will have a private chef sent to your room immediately. Whatever you require, it is already done." I took my room key card from his shaking hand, sliding the titanium card back into my purse. "Burn this dress when I take it off," I told him calmly, "and make sure I am not disturbed." The next morning, the sun rose brightly over the Manhattan skyline. Carter was feeling invincible. He strutted into a highly exclusive upscale coffee shop in the financial district, leading a very important prospective client toward the counter. He was boasting loudly about his connections, his upcoming promotions, and how his family was about to close a massive real estate deal, desperate to impress the wealthy investor standing next to him. Carter confidently ordered 2 imported coffees and a selection of artisan pastries, ensuring the total was suitably expensive to show off his casual wealth. With a practiced, arrogant flourish, he whipped out his shiny platinum bank card and slid it into the chip reader, grinning at his client. The machine processed for 3 seconds. Then it emitted a loud, harsh, red flashing beep that echoed through the quiet, affluent coffee shop. The barista, a young woman who looked entirely unimpressed by Carter's tailored suit, glanced at the terminal screen. She looked back up at him with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "I am sorry, sir," the barista said, her voice carrying over the morning chatter. "Your card is declined." Carter scoffed loudly. his face flushing red as he felt the client's eyes burning into the side of his head. He aggressively tapped the machine. "Run it again," Carter demanded sharply. "That is a platinum account with a massive limit. Your machine must be broken. Do you have any idea who I am?" The barista did not flinch. She simply shook her head, turned the digital monitor around, and read the bright red text aloud for everyone in the line to hear. "It is not an error, sir," she stated clearly. "The system says the account has been completely frozen by the primary account holder." The morning sun poured through the massive bay windows of Edward's dining room, illuminating a lavish breakfast spread of imported caviar, smoked salmon, and crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne. The entire family was gathered around the long mahogany table, toasting to their supposed victory. Carter had stormed into the house just 20 minutes earlier, his face flushed red with anger after the humiliating incident at the coffee shop. He had ranted about the frozen credit cards pacing the length of the Persian rug, but Edward simply waved a dismissive hand and poured his son a glass of champagne. Edward confidently assured Carter that Melody had likely just reported the cards stolen in a petty, desperate attempt to cause an inconvenience. He insisted that without Carter's banking salary, the quiet freelance data analyst would be crawling back on her knees begging for forgiveness by the end of the week. Brittany Carter's sister clinked her crystal glass against her father's with a malicious laugh. She lounged in her silk robe, gloating about how Carter was finally free to marry a woman from their own elite social circle. She loudly proclaimed that the house already felt cleaner without the cheap scent of a public school teacher's daughter contaminating their high society air. Their celebration was abruptly cut short by the heavy, rhythmic thud of hard plastic hitting wooden stairs. The dining room fell silent as everyone turned to look at the grand staircase. DeAndre was walking down the steps, his broad shoulders set back, carrying two massive, fully packed travel suitcases. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit, looking every bit the brilliant cardiothoracic surgeon he was. But his face held no warmth. His jaw was clenched tight, and his dark eyes swept over the extravagant breakfast spread with pure, unfiltered disgust. Brittany set her champagne glass down so hard the crystal nearly shattered. She stood up, crossing her arms over her chest, glaring at her husband. She demanded to know what he was doing bringing luggage into the formal dining room. She asked if he had another last-minute medical conference and complained that he was supposed to attend a charity luncheon with her that afternoon to show off his new promotion. "I am not going to any luncheon," DeAndre said, his voice deep and echoing with absolute finality. "I am leaving Brittany. I am leaving you, and I am leaving this toxic house." Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking around the table at her father and brother, as if DeAndre had just told a hilarious joke. When she realized he was entirely serious, her face twisted into an ugly snarl. She marched right up to him, pointing a manicured finger directly at his chest. She screamed that he was making a fool of himself. She called him an ungrateful nobody, reminding him loudly that before he married into her family, he was just an overworked resident drowning in medical school debt. She practically spit the words at him, claiming that her father had built his private surgical clinic from the ground up, and that without her family wealth, DeAndre would be absolutely nothing. DeAndre did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick folded stack of official financial documents, and slammed them down right in the middle of the breakfast spread. The heavy stack of papers knocked over a champagne flute, sending golden liquid spilling across the mahogany wood. "Read them," DeAndre commanded, his voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "Go ahead, Edward. Tell your daughter exactly who funded my clinic." Edward looked at the papers, his arrogant smirk faltering. Carter leaned over, snatching the top document. It was a certified bank transfer receipt for $3 million. Carter's eyes darted to the bottom of the page, searching for his father's corporate signature. Instead, he saw a completely different crest. It was the bold, unmistakable logo of Vanguard Holdings, and right below it, listed as the primary financial guarantor, was a single signature: Melody. "You think your father funded my surgical clinic?" DeAndre asked, staring a hole right through Brittany's shocked face. Melody paid for it in full 2 years ago, while you all called her a leech. She quietly wired the capital through a private equity subsidiary because she knew your father's real estate business was entirely bankrupt. Your father never had the money, Brittany. He just took the credit. The color completely drained from Edward's face. He fell back into his leather dining chair, his mouth opening and closing silently. Carter dropped the paper as if it had physically burned his fingers. He aggressively shook his head, shouting that the documents had to be forged, that there was no possible way his quiet, plain wife had access to millions of dollars in private equity capital. Edward's shock rapidly morphed into violent defensive anger. He slammed his fists on the table, ordering DeAndre to get out of his sight. He screamed that if DeAndre wanted to walk away from his beautiful daughter and side with a deceptive gold digger, he could leave with absolutely nothing. Edward pointed a shaking finger at the front door, demanding that DeAndre leave the keys to the brand-new Mercedes-Benz sitting in the driveway, loudly claiming he had bought that luxury car as a wedding gift. DeAndre reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn, heavy keyring and tossed it through the air. The keys hit the center of the dining table with a harsh clatter. Edward looked down. They were not the sleek digital keys to a modern Mercedes. They were the rusted plastic keys to a 15-year-old sedan. The Mercedes is legally registered to my medical practice as a corporate vehicle, DeAndre stated coldly, picking up his suitcases. And since Melody legally owns the entire building, my practice operates and the car stays with me. You can keep the sedan. I hear it gets great gas mileage. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She ran after DeAndre as he turned his back on them and walked out the front door, begging him to stop, demanding he explain what was happening. DeAndre did not even pause. He walked down the driveway, loaded his suitcases into the gleaming black Mercedes, and drove away without a single backward glance, leaving Brittany stranded and sobbing on the front porch. Back in the dining room, the heavy silence was suffocating. Carter stood frozen, staring at the financial documents scattered among the spilled champagne, his mind desperately trying to comprehend how his entire reality was unraveling in a matter of hours. Then his cell phone began to violently vibrate in his pocket. Carter pulled the device out with shaking hands. The screen lit up with an urgent, high-priority text message from the managing director of his investment bank. The message did not contain a greeting. It was just 2 sentences that made Carter's blood run entirely cold. "Get to the office immediately. Security is waiting for you at the front desk." Carter ignored the racing of his pulse as he shoved his phone back into his pocket. The furious text from his boss was just a misunderstanding, he told himself. He smoothed the lapels of his custom Tom Ford suit and strode through the revolving glass doors of the towering Wall Street investment bank. Today was supposed to be his crowning achievement. He was scheduled to pitch a massive $50 million bailout package to the board, a deal specifically designed to rescue his father's sinking real estate firm under the guise of a prime commercial acquisition. Carter tipped his chin up, flashing his practiced, arrogant smile at the receptionists. He fully expected to be greeted with the usual deference owed to a vice president. Instead of the usual chorus of good mornings, the lobby fell into a tense, suffocating hush as he approached the security turnstiles. His executive assistant, a young woman who normally handed him his iced Americano the second he walked in, refused to make eye contact. She stared firmly at the floor, clutching her clipboard. Before Carter could even swipe his platinum access badge, 2 massive security guards in dark suits stepped directly into his path, blocking the biometric gates. Carter scoffed, rolling his eyes at the sheer incompetence of the building staff. He demanded they step aside, boasting loudly about his 9 o'clock meeting with the board of directors. The taller guard did not flinch. He simply placed a heavy hand on Carter's chest and instructed him to hand over his corporate briefcase. Carter was not going to the executive boardroom on the 50th floor. He was being escorted to the windowless human resources department in the basement. The HR office was sterile cold and smelled sharply of bleach. Carter dropped into an uncomfortable metal chair, straightening his tie as if he still held all the power in the room. Sitting across from him was Sarah, the notoriously ruthless director of human resources, flanked by the head of corporate security and Carter's own managing director. Carter leaned back, crossing his ankle over his knee, and laughed. He told them they were wasting his time, reminding them of the $50 million pitch he had ready to deliver. Sarah did not smile. She reached under the table and pulled out a massive 500-page printed binder, slamming it down so hard the metal table rattled. Carter recognized it instantly. It was his award-winning risk assessment model. It was the exact financial algorithm that had earned him his vice president title, his six-figure bonuses, and his untouchable reputation at the bank. Sarah opened the binder to the final page, highlighting a dense block of technical data. She informed Carter that the bank's internal cybersecurity team had conducted a random routine audit of all executive-level projects. They discovered something highly irregular in the metadata. The IP addresses for every single complex financial model, every predictive algorithm, and every flawless market projection in Carter's portfolio did not originate from the bank. They did not even originate from Carter's secure corporate laptop. Carter felt a sudden icy drop in his stomach. He tried to speak, but Sarah cut him off, reading the unredacted digital logs aloud. Every single piece of brilliant analytical work had been generated from an external, unregistered device. It was a cheap, outdated commercial laptop registered to a local IP address. The address matched Carter's home network, specifically a device belonging to Melody. The managing director looked at Carter with sheer, unadulterated disgust. The timestamps on the files showed the heavy data lifting the complex coding, and the flawless mathematical models were entirely built between midnight and 4 in the morning. Those were the exact hours Carter was out drinking top-shelf liquor with clients, playing golf, or sleeping off his hangovers. Carter had never done the work. He did not even understand the math behind his own pitches. His quiet, supposedly uneducated wife had been doing his job for him every single day for 5 years. Panic seized Carter's chest, but his narcissism refused to let him surrender. He slammed his hands on the table, desperately trying to throw Melody under the bus to save his own skin. He shouted that his wife was just a low-level freelance data entry clerk, a nobody who merely organized his raw, brilliant ideas into spreadsheets. He insisted she was just a secretary handling the tedious typing, while he provided the actual genius. The managing director stood up, shaking his head. He informed Carter that passing off classified, highly sensitive banking analytics to an unvetted, unapproved third party was a massive breach of federal financial regulations. Carter was not just a fraud who relied on his wife to look smart. He was a monumental legal liability to the entire institution. Sarah pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. Carter was officially suspended without pay, effective immediately pending a full federal review of his actions. They demanded his keycard, his corporate cell phone, and his building access tokens. Carter tried to argue, threatening to sue them for wrongful termination, but the security guards stepped forward, physically pulling him out of the chair. 10 minutes later, Carter found himself standing on the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, holding a pathetic cardboard box filled with his personalized pens and framed country club photos. The cold reality of his situation crashed over him. His entire identity, his wealth, and his arrogant leverage over Melody were entirely tied to his banking title. Without his massive salary, he had absolutely no way to pay for the elite divorce lawyers he needed to crush her, and he certainly could not pay off the secret mounting debts he had hidden from his family. Desperate and hyperventilating, Carter pulled out his personal cell phone. He had to call his father. Edward was the only one who could bail him out of this nightmare. He needed a cash loan immediately to hire a crisis management team to spin this HR disaster before the news hit the financial sector. He dialed the number, pacing frantically near a subway grate. Edward answered on the second ring, but Carter could barely hear him. The background noise coming through the speaker was absolutely deafening. There were men shouting aggressively, the sound of heavy construction machinery cutting out abruptly, and the harsh screech of police sirens in the distance. Carter yelled into the receiver, demanding a massive loan, screaming that his firm had just suspended him because Melody had sabotaged his computer files. He begged his father for an advance on the $50 million bailout they were supposed to secure today. Edward did not even process Carter's frantic words. The older man was hyperventilating, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. Edward screamed through the phone with a voice completely broken by panic. "Carter, you have to get down here right now. The bank just showed up with armed marshals and seized our entire construction site. They locked down the gates and froze all our operating accounts. Our primary investor just vanished overnight and took all the capital with him. We have absolutely nothing left." Carter stood paralyzed on the busy Manhattan sidewalk, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his phone. The blare of city traffic faded into a dull roar beneath the sheer panic radiating from his father. Edward was hyperventilating on the other end of the line, repeating the words that signaled the total collapse of their empire. The primary investor had not just backed out, they had completely liquidated their position and vanished, triggering an automatic default that allowed the bank to seize the flagship construction site. Carter dropped the cardboard box containing his office supplies directly into a corner trash can and hailed a taxi, his mind racing. He arrived at Edward's corporate office to find his father looking older than he ever had. Edward's tie was undone, his face ashen, and his desk littered with foreclosure notices. They needed cash immediately. Not in a week, not in a few days, but by the close of business. They needed a massive injection of capital to stop the cascading defaults that would publicly bankrupt the family name. Carter slammed his hands on his father's desk and proposed the only lifeline they had left. He and Melody lived in a sprawling, historic brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. It was easily worth $7 million. Carter suggested they march down to a private lender and take out a secret, highly leveraged second mortgage on the property. They could pull millions in liquid cash immediately to unfreeze Edward's construction sites. Carter reasoned that since he had already locked Melody out of the house and frozen her bank cards, she was likely sleeping on a friend's couch, completely oblivious and entirely powerless to stop him. Within the hour, Carter and Edward were striding through the heavy glass doors of Sterling Elite Financial, an exclusive private bank catering to high-net-worth individuals. Carter adjusted his posture, burying his recent termination beneath a mask of absolute arrogance. He demanded a meeting with a senior loan officer and was quickly ushered into the glass-walled office of a man named Mr. Harrison. Carter took a seat, aggressively dropping a thick folder of expedited loan applications onto the polished mahogany desk. He flashed his signature charismatic smile, introducing himself as a vice president at a top-tier investment bank, and explaining that his father merely needed a short-term bridge loan to finalize a massive real estate acquisition. Carter confidently requested a $4 million cash withdrawal against the equity of his Brooklyn home. Mr. Harrison, a sharp man with calm, observant eyes, opened the folder and reviewed the paperwork. He tapped his pen against the desk, pointing to the final page of the contract. He politely noted that since the property was a marital home, the bank required both Carter and his wife to be present to sign the legally binding documents. Carter did not even blink. He let out a dismissive chuckle, waving his hand as if the loan officer had just stated a minor inconvenience. He claimed his wife was out of the country on a trivial freelance assignment and had given him full power of attorney to handle their domestic finances. Without waiting for permission, Carter reached across the desk, pulled the contract toward him, and uncapped his expensive fountain pen. With practiced fluid precision, Carter forged Melody's signature directly onto the bottom line. He did not hesitate, because he had done this exact thing a dozen times over the last 5 years. He had forged Melody's name on tax documents, auto leases, and personal credit line extensions to hide his reckless spending and mounting gambling debts. He had always viewed her clean financial record as his own personal backup generator. He slid the forged contract back across the desk with a smug, self-satisfied grin, telling the loan officer to process the wire transfer immediately. Mr. Harrison looked down at the freshly inked signature. His expression remained entirely neutral as he turned to his computer and began typing. The rhythmic clacking of his keyboard filled the quiet office. Carter and Edward exchanged a look of pure relief, believing they had just successfully conned their way out of total ruin. But the typing stopped. Mr. Harrison frowned slightly, adjusting his glasses. He clicked his mouse, opened a new window, and stared at the screen. The confusion on his face deepened into a look of absolute bewilderment. He read the screen again, then looked up at Carter, slowly sliding the forged mortgage application back across the mahogany desk. I am sorry, Mr. Carter. The loan officer said, his voice dropping to a serious, cautious tone. I cannot process this application. I will have to ask you both to leave my office. Carter's arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of violent defensive rage. He slammed his fist onto the armrest of his chair and leaned forward, his face turning an ugly shade of red. He demanded to know what the problem was. He shouted that his credit was immaculate, completely ignoring the fact that his bank had suspended him just hours ago. Edward chimed in loudly, throwing his weight around, threatening to pull his entire corporate portfolio from the bank, and ensuring Mr. Harrison would be fired by the end of the day for disrespecting two of the city's most elite businessmen. Mr. Harrison did not flinch at the threats. He calmly reached out and grabbed the edge of his computer monitor. You can threaten my job all you want, gentlemen, Mr. Harrison said, his voice steady and remarkably cold. But no bank in this country is going to approve a loan against this collateral. Mr. Harrison swiveled the monitor completely around, pushing it toward the edge of the desk so Carter and Edward could read the official property deed displayed on the screen in stark black and white text. Sir, you do not own this property, Mr. Harrison stated, looking Carter dead in the eyes. It was purchased in cash 3 years ago by a blind trust. Your wife is the sole trustee. You are not on the deed. You are not on the title. You are legally just a guest. The heavy glass doors of the private bank swung shut, leaving Carter standing on the busy Manhattan sidewalk in a state of absolute shock. The reality of the bank manager's words pounded in his skull. He did not own the Brooklyn brownstone. He was merely a guest in a house purchased in cash by a blind trust, a trust completely controlled by the very woman he had just thrown out onto the lawn. His phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. It was Brittany. She was hysterical, screaming through the receiver that DeAndre was truly gone, taking the surgical clinic, the corporate car, and his 6-figure salary, with him leaving her stranded and humiliated at their father's crumbling estate. Carter ordered his sister to get a cab and meet him in Midtown immediately. He had pulled Melody's corporate credit profile through a backdoor contact he still retained at the bank before his administrative access was entirely revoked. He knew exactly where she was. Vanguard Holdings maintained a permanent, ultra-exclusive corporate account at the Four Seasons. An hour later, Carter and Brittany stormed through the grand brass doors of the Four Seasons lobby. They looked entirely out of place in the serene, opulent environment. Carter's expensive tuxedo from the previous night was deeply wrinkled. His tie was ripped off, and his face was pale with manic desperation. Brittany's designer silk robe had been hastily swapped for a mismatched sweater and jeans, her mascara smeared under her eyes from crying over DeAndre's defection. They scanned the cavernous marble-floored room, ignoring the disapproving glances of wealthy guests and the alarmed posture of the hotel staff. They spotted her immediately. Melody was sitting in a plush velvet armchair near the grand piano, bathed in the soft afternoon light, streaming through the massive arched windows. She looked nothing like the quiet, submissive woman they had bullied for 5 years. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray Chanel suit. Her posture was relaxed, her expression serene, and she was calmly reading a financial newspaper while sipping from a porcelain teacup. Carter did not hesitate. He marched across the lobby, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the marble with Brittany right on his heels. He bypassed the low mahogany coffee table and stepped directly into Melody's personal space, looming over her to use his physical size as leverage. Brittany flanked her on the right, effectively boxing Melody into the corner of the seating arrangement to physically intimidate her. "Sign it over right now," Carter hissed, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper that carried through the quiet lounge. He reached into his jacket and slammed a hastily printed quitclaim deed onto the table right next to her teacup. "You are going to sign the Brooklyn house over to my father's firm today. You set me up, Melody. You orchestrated this entire financial disaster, and now you are going to fix it." Brittany leaned in closer, her face contorted with pure malice. "You ruined my marriage, you vindictive parasite," she snarled, her voice rising in pitch. "DeAndre left me because you poisoned his mind with your fake investments. You are going to give us that house, and you are going to pay for the damages you caused my family, or we will drag your name through the mud. We will tell everyone in this city that you are a fraud." Carter slammed his hand flat on the table, leaning his face mere inches from Melody's. "You are a nobody," he spat, his breath hot with desperation. "You think a blind trust protects you. I know judges in this city. I know lawyers who will tie you up in litigation for the next decade until you are completely bankrupt. Sign the paper, Melody. Do not make me force your hand right here in front of everyone." Melody did not flinch. She did not shrink back into the velvet armchair, and she certainly did not reach for the pen Carter had thrown down. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, placed the porcelain cup back onto its saucer with a gentle clink, and looked up at her husband and sister-in-law. Her eyes were completely devoid of fear. She simply raised her right hand and snapped her fingers. The sharp sound cracked through the tension. Instantly, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. From the shadows of the grand marble pillars, four massive men materialized. They wore impeccable dark tailored suits with discreet communication earpieces curled around their necks. They moved with terrifying silent speed. Before Carter could even register their presence, the bodyguards had surrounded the seating area, forming an impenetrable human wall of solid muscle. Two of them stepped directly behind Carter, their sheer size making him look instantly small, while the other two positioned themselves firmly on either side of Brittany. The lead bodyguard, a towering man with a thick scar crossing his jawline, placed a heavy, immovable hand on Carter's shoulder. "Step back from Ms. Vanguard." The guard ordered, his voice a low, gravelly threat that left no room for negotiation. Carter swallowed hard, his arrogant posture crumbling as he was forcibly pushed back. Brittany gasped, shrinking away from the men flanking her, suddenly realizing the massive physical and social power disparity in the room. Melody calmly picked up the quitclaim deed Carter had thrown on the table. She tore the paper precisely in half, then in half again, and let the pieces flutter into a nearby wastebasket. She reached into her designer leather tote bag resting on the floor beside her and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. She walked right up to Carter, who was now pinned in place by the bodyguards, and slapped the heavy folder directly against his chest. "I filed for divorce this morning," Melody said, her voice projecting with absolute icy authority. "But you will not be fighting for alimony." Carter's face went completely ashen. He instinctively grabbed the folder, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he flipped open the manila cover. His eyes darted across the top page, and his breath hitched in his throat. Inside the folder was a mountain of devastating, irrefutable evidence. There were high-definition time-stamped photographs of Carter sitting at illegal offshore gambling tables in Macau and Monaco, trips he had explicitly claimed were for client networking. Beneath the vivid photos were stacks of highly classified bank statements, wire transfer logs, and encrypted digital receipts. For the past 3 years, Carter had been silently siphoning money from his investment bank's mid-tier clients. He had set up dummy accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his massive, spiraling gambling debts, completely confident that his firm's auditing software would never catch him. He did not realize that the freelance data analyst wife he had forced to build all of his security algorithms had intentionally built a backdoor tracking system into his coding. She had meticulously recorded every single stolen dollar, every illegal wire transfer, and every forged authorization signature. "You embezzled over $8 million from your own clients to pay off your offshore gambling syndicates," Melody stated clearly, watching the absolute terror wash over his face. "You used the security software I designed for you to cover your tracks. My corporate investigators have compiled an airtight digital trail of every financial felony you have committed since the day we got married." Carter was physically shaking now, the papers rattling in his hands. He looked at Melody, his eyes wide with a terror he had never experienced in his entire privileged life. Brittany peered over his shoulder at the embezzlement records, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream as she realized her brother was looking at a decade in federal prison. "If you do not sign the divorce papers by Friday, this goes to the FBI." The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Bridge Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the grand ballroom, But the brilliant light did nothing to thaw the desperate panic suffocating Edward and his daughter Brittany. Edward had organized this emergency charity gala in under 48 hours. He had pulled every string, called in every favor, and maxed out his last remaining lines of corporate credit just to rent the venue and hire the catering staff. It was a thinly veiled, high-stakes performance designed to project absolute financial stability to the city's elite. He desperately needed to secure a new primary investor tonight. If he failed to raise the massive amount of capital required, his entire commercial real estate empire would officially face federal foreclosure by Monday morning. Brittany stood rigidly by his side near the ice sculpture, clutching a flute of champagne so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She was trying frantically to maintain the illusion of an untouchable, wealthy socialite, but the reality of her life was rapidly collapsing. Her husband, DeAndre, had walked out on her days ago. He had taken his highly lucrative surgical practice, frozen their joint bank accounts, and reclaimed the luxury corporate vehicles, leaving her completely stranded and publicly humiliated. With her brother Carter currently paralyzed by a looming FBI embezzlement investigation, the burden of saving the family's social standing had fallen entirely on her shoulders. She plastered a fake, strained smile on her face, aggressively schmoozing with the wives of the hedge fund managers Edward was desperately trying to court. Then the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open. The low hum of classical music and polite conversation did not just fade. It abruptly died. The entire room turned toward the entrance, captivated by a sudden magnetic shift in the atmosphere. Walking through the grand archway was Melody. She looked absolutely nothing like the quiet, submissive woman the family had treated like a glorified data entry clerk for 5 years. She was radiant, draped in a breathtaking $25,000 custom Armani gown that cascaded around her frame like liquid silver. Her posture was flawless, projecting an aura of effortless, untouchable power. She was not walking alone. Her hand was tucked securely into the arm of DeAndre. Brittany's estranged husband wore a razor-sharp, bespoke tuxedo, looking incredibly distinguished and entirely unbothered by the sudden deafening silence of the room. He led Melody into the ballroom with the calm assurance of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. They did not look like guests. They looked like royalty arriving to survey their domain. Brittany's jaw unhinged. The champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering sharply against the polished marble floor. The loud crash snapped her out of her paralysis and ignited a blind, irrational fury deep within her chest. How dare her husband parade into her exclusive restricted access country club with her despised, supposedly bankrupt sister-in-law? It was the ultimate, unforgivable public humiliation. Brittany completely forgot about Edward's desperate need to secure investors. She forgot about the delicate social graces required in this room. She stormed across the ballroom floor, her heels striking the marble like hammer blows, ignoring the shocked, murmuring stares of the wealthiest people in the city. She bypassed Melody and DeAndre entirely. Instead, she marched directly toward Arthur Sterling, the patrician, silver-haired president of the Oakbridge Country Club. Arthur was standing near the center of the room, quietly conversing with two prominent billionaires, the exact men Edward was relying on to save his firm. Brittany shoved her way aggressively into their intimate circle, her face twisted into an ugly, unhinged snarl. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger across the room at the new arrivals. Brittany demanded that Arthur call security immediately. She screeched that the club's strict elite guest policies were being flagrantly violated. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch as she loudly demanded that he throw the ghetto doctor and the maid out into the street where they belonged. She ranted that DeAndre was nothing but a bitter, vindictive ex trying to cause a scene to ruin her pristine reputation. She insisted that Melody was just a penniless, fraudulent secretary who had somehow conned her way past the valet station. She commanded Arthur to have them physically removed before they completely derailed her father's prestigious charity event. Arthur Sterling did not leap into action to defend the family honor. He did not signal for the maitre d' to apologize for the intrusion. Instead, he slowly and deliberately lowered his crystal Scotch glass. He looked at Brittany, his expression contorting from polite neutrality into sheer unadulterated disgust. The two billionaires standing beside him took a collective step back, immediately sensing the violent shift in the room's power dynamic. Arthur straightened his posture. His voice was cold, sharp, and loud enough to carry across the suddenly silent, echoing ballroom. He raised a single hand, signaling the four massive uniformed security guards stationed at the ballroom exits. The guards immediately moved forward, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. But they did not march toward the entrance to flank Melody and DeAndre. They completely ignored the new arrivals, moving with purposeful speed toward the center of the room. They surrounded Brittany and a rapidly approaching, sweating Edward, forming a tight, inescapable circle around the father and daughter. Arthur looked Brittany dead in the eyes, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. He informed her that she was in absolutely no position to dictate club policy, let alone insult the esteemed guests of his establishment. He stated with brutal, crushing clarity that security was indeed going to remove someone from the premises immediately, but it was going to be her and her father. Edward pushed his way through the guards, his face pale and slick with sweat, demanding to know the meaning of this outrage. He shouted that he was hosting a charity gala and paying for the venue. Arthur did not hesitate to shatter that illusion. He announced to the watching crowd of elite investors that Edward's legacy membership had been permanently revoked for non-payment of dues and a history of bounced checks just this morning. The charity gala was effectively cancelled. Arthur then turned his back on the disgraced family and faced the entrance, offering a deep, highly respectful bow. He informed the humiliated father and daughter that Miss Melody was not a trespasser. She was the club's new majority shareholder. The heavy brass-studded oak doors of the Oakbridge Country Club slammed shut with a deafening thud, locking the three of them out in the cold. A sudden torrential downpour had swept over the estate, unleashing sheets of freezing, unforgiving rain. The four massive security guards had not simply escorted them to the exit. They had physically marched them down the pristine marble steps and shoved them onto the slick, wet pavement of the valet roundabout like common trespassers. The icy rain immediately soaked through Edward's custom-tailored suit, plastering the expensive wool to his skin. He stood trembling on the curb, staring at the closed doors of the sanctuary that had defined his entire social identity for 3 decades. The absolute reality of his ruin crashed down on him heavier than the storm. He was bankrupt. He was a public pariah. And it was all because of his son. Edward whipped around, his face contorted with a violent, unrestrained fury. He lunged forward and grabbed Carter by the soaked lapels of his ruined tuxedo, violently shaking the younger man. "You married a witch!" Edward bellowed, his voice cracking over the roar of the rain. "You arrogant, incompetent fool! You brought that woman into my house. You let her control your finances, you let her build your algorithms, and you let her single-handedly dismantle my entire empire. You have destroyed our family name." Carter violently shoved his father's hands away, his own panic morphing into vicious defensive rage. He wiped the freezing water from his eyes and immediately pivoted, redirecting his terror entirely onto his sister. Brittany was shivering uncontrollably near the curb, her arms wrapped around herself as the rain completely ruined her hair and washed away her expensive makeup in dark, muddy streaks. "This is your fault!" Carter screamed, marching toward her with his fists clenched. "We were seconds away from cornering her. We could have negotiated. We could have dragged her out quietly and forced a settlement. But you just had to open your mouth. You had to throw a hysterical tantrum in front of the club president, and the only 2 billionaires left in this city who were willing to take my phone calls. You blew our last chance." "Do not you dare blame me for your mess!" Brittany shrieked back, her voice raw and hysterical. "You are the one facing federal prison, Carter. You embezzled millions of dollars DeAndre left me because of the toxic, fraudulent mess you brought into our lives." The perfectly manicured elite family dynamic had completely evaporated, replaced by feral animals tearing at each other in the mud. They were screaming so loudly they almost did not hear the grand glass doors of the club slide open behind them. The shouting abruptly ceased. Carter, Edward, and Brittany turned to see DeAndre stepping out onto the covered portico. He was completely untouched by the chaos. A uniformed valet held a massive black golf umbrella over his head, shielding his pristine tuxedo from the storm. DeAndre did not look angry. He did not look vindictive. He looked entirely indifferent, which was infinitely worse. A sleek, jet-black Maybach glided silently up the winding driveway, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. The luxury vehicle stopped perfectly in front of the portico. The chauffeur stepped out into the rain, opening the rear passenger door for the esteemed surgeon. Brittany's rage instantly dissolved into pathetic, clawing desperation. She saw her former life, her wealth, her status, her absolute security about to drive away forever. She scrambled up from the wet curb, her high heels slipping dangerously on the slick asphalt, and threw herself toward the vehicle. "DeAndre, please," Brittany sobbed, slapping her wet hands against the tinted glass of the rear passenger door. "Please do not do this. I have nothing left. My father is bankrupt. Carter is going to jail. You cannot just leave me out here in the street. Let me in the car." She yanked frantically at the chrome door handle, but it remained firmly locked. Inside the cavernous, leather-lined cabin, DeAndre did not turn his head. He pressed a button on the armrest. The heavy, soundproof window glided down exactly 2 inches. Brittany gasped, leaning in, expecting a word of comfort, a temporary reprieve, or a second chance. DeAndre did not speak a single word. His perfectly manicured hand simply extended toward the narrow gap. He slid a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope through the opening. It dropped directly into Brittany's trembling, soaking wet hands. The window immediately sealed shut with a quiet, mechanical hum. Brittany stared down at the envelope. Across the front, stamped in bold red ink, were the words, "Expedited dissolution of marriage. Final decree." The Maybach pulled away from the curb smoothly, its red taillights bleeding into the gray storm, leaving Brittany collapsing to her knees on the wet asphalt, clutching her executed divorce papers against her chest. Carter ignored his sister's sobbing. He was pacing back and forth across the driveway like a caged animal, his mind fracturing under the weight of the FBI threat. Melody had the digital logs. She had the offshore account numbers. If he did not surrender everything by Friday, he was going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. He needed leverage. He needed a war chest of liquid capital to hire a team of ruthless defense attorneys. Suddenly, his cell phone chimed a harsh, piercing digital alert that cut straight through the sound of the rain. Carter froze. He yanked the device from his soaked pocket. The screen was smeared with water, but he could clearly read the high-priority automated alert that had just bypassed his spam filter. It was an email addressed directly to the executive board of his father's holding company. The sender was Vanguard Holdings Private Equity. Carter's eyes widened completely, failing to process the horrific irony of the name. His adrenaline-soaked brain, blinded by pure narcissism and desperation, saw only a corporate entity. He saw an impersonal, multi-billion-dollar financial institution. He rapidly tapped the screen, opening the attached PDF document. It was a formal, legally binding letter of intent. Vanguard Holdings was offering a massive immediate cash buyout to acquire Edwards' failing commercial real estate empire in its entirety. The capital injection was astronomical, more than enough to clear Edwards' defaults, reinstate their social standing, and fund a monumental legal war against Melody. Carter's breathing hitched. A wide, manic grin stretched across his wet face. He looked at his father, who was leaning against a lamppost in defeat, and his sister, who was weeping in the gutter. He did not see the trap closing its jaws perfectly around his neck. He only saw a lifeline. Carter threw his head back, letting the freezing rain wash over his face, and laughed maniacally in the rain. "We're saved. Vanguard wants to buy us out. Melody is dead meat." Carter stood in the pouring rain, the glow of the Vanguard Holdings email illuminating his manic-soaked face. The sheer adrenaline of salvation masked the freezing cold. He ignored his sister, shivering on the curb, clutching her divorce papers, and his father leaning heavily against a street lamp. Carter wiped the rainwater from his phone screen and opened his text thread with Melody. His thumbs flew across the digital keyboard, furiously typing out a barrage of pure, unadulterated venom. He explicitly detailed how Vanguard Holdings, the most ruthless private equity firm in the country, was stepping in to buy out his father's failing firm. He bragged that by Friday morning, he would have an endless war chest of corporate capital. He threatened to hire an army of predatory lawyers to tie up the Brooklyn brownstone in federal litigation for a decade. He promised to launch a countersuit that would bury her in legal fees, explicitly swearing to leave her bankrupt, homeless, and begging on the street. He hit send, a cruel, satisfied sneer twisting his features. He truly believed he had just checkmated her, convinced that his billionaire status was about to be fully restored. Miles away, high above the chaotic Manhattan streets, Melody sat perfectly still behind a massive custom-carved oak desk. The penthouse office of Vanguard Holdings was a masterclass in quiet, intimidating power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the city skyline. There was no clutter, no frantic paperwork, just the sleek hum of a high-altitude corporate command center. Her personal cell phone buzzed softly against the polished wood. She picked it up, her expression entirely neutral as she read Carter's aggressive, poorly spelled threat. He was boasting about Vanguard's money, completely blind to the fact that the very security algorithms he had stolen to cover his gambling debts were the exact algorithms she had patented and sold to build Vanguard's initial capital foundation. She had spent 5 years playing the submissive, quiet wife, silently constructing a financial empire right under his arrogant nose. She did not feel a single ounce of fear reading his pathetic threats. She picked up her bone china cup, took a slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee, and set it down. Her manicured fingers tapped out a brief, surgically precise reply. "Congratulations, I hear the CEO is dying to meet you." The notification pinged in Carter's hand back down on the street. He read Melody's reply aloud to his father, barking a harsh, dismissive laugh. He mocked her, claiming she was trying to sound intimidating when she was clearly terrified of the Vanguard name. Edward did not share his son's amusement. The older man grabbed Carter by the shoulder, hauling him out of the rain and under the awning of a closed storefront. Edward's face was gaunt, but his eyes burned with a desperate, frantic energy. He declared that Vanguard Holdings did not just hand over multi-million-dollar buyouts to desperate men who looked like drowned rats. They needed to walk into that boardroom tomorrow projecting absolute, untouchable wealth. Edward demanded that Carter and Brittany empty their final hidden emergency accounts. Carter hesitated, his voice dropping as he admitted that his remaining cash was meant for his federal defense retainer to keep the FBI at bay. Brittany clutched her ruined designer bag to her chest, crying that her hidden funds were all she had left to survive since DeAndre froze everything she owned. Edward viciously shot them both down. He cornered his children, shouting that if they did not secure this Vanguard deal tomorrow morning, there would be no defense retainers and no survival funds because they would all be utterly publicly ruined. He forced them to pull out their phones and immediately wire transfer every single remaining dollar they possessed into his private account. Within minutes, the family's very last safety net was completely drained. Edward dragged them to a high-end exclusive boutique in the financial district that catered to emergency elite tailoring. He unapologetically blew through their final reserves, purchasing matching bespoke Italian wool suits for himself and Carter, and a severe, authoritative designer dress for Brittany. The exorbitant price tag wiped out the last of their liquid cash, leaving their accounts entirely overdrawn. They stood in the fitting room mirrors, adjusting their silk ties and diamond cufflinks, completely destitute on paper, but looking exactly like old money billionaires. Edward adjusted his collar explicitly, telling his children that perception was reality, and tomorrow Vanguard was going to hand them the keys to the city. The morning sun broke over the Manhattan skyline, casting sharp rays of light through the glass walls of the Vanguard Holdings executive suite. Melody stood by the window, wearing a tailored crimson power suit that radiated absolute authority. She checked her diamond watch. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. Carter and Edward were scheduled to arrive in 30 minutes to sign the buyout contracts that would legally surrender every remaining asset Edward owned directly over to Vanguard. Melody walked slowly back to her massive oak desk and pressed the silver button on her intercom console. Her voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any mercy. "Security," she instructed, staring down at the sweeping city below. When Edward and Carter arrived for the 9 o'clock acquisition meeting, disable the executive elevators. Let them walk up 40 flights of stairs. Carter's lungs burned with the intensity of inhaled battery acid. He stumbled through the heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Holdings executive boardroom, his legs trembling violently beneath the soaking wet bespoke Italian wool suit he had purchased just hours prior. Edward staggered in right behind him, his face an alarming shade of mottled purple clutching his chest as he fought for oxygen. Brittany brought up the rear, practically crawling into the room. She collapsed instantly into one of the plush leather chairs, tossing her ruined designer heels onto the polished mahogany table with a choked sob. They had just climbed 40 flights of stairs. The impeccably dressed, terrifyingly calm receptionist in the lobby had handed them bright red visitor badges with a sharp, knowing smile, informing them that the executive elevators were undergoing emergency maintenance. She had completely ignored their furious threats to have her fired, simply pointing them toward the concrete stairwell. Driven by the desperate, blinding greed of the impending buyout, they had swallowed their pride and begun the agonizing ascent. Now they were inside the inner sanctum. The boardroom was a sprawling, ultra-modern cage of soundproof glass and brushed steel perched at the very apex of the Manhattan skyline. But the initial relief of simply sitting down evaporated within minutes. The climate control in the executive suite was set to an Arctic temperature. The blast of freezing air slammed into their sweat-soaked clothing, instantly turning the expensive fabrics into icy, clinging traps. Carter shivered violently, wrapping his arms around himself as his teeth began to chatter. He glared through the transparent glass walls, expecting an army of corporate assistants to rush in with hot coffee-bottled water and immediate apologies for the inconvenience. Nobody came. The sleek, minimalist hallway outside the boardroom remained completely deserted. The digital clock on the wall read 9:15 in the morning. An hour crawled by. Then two. By the third grueling hour, the physical and psychological torture had completely stripped away their polished billionaire facades. They were severely dehydrated, their mouths dry and tasting of copper from the grueling physical exertion. Their stomachs cramped with sharp, painful hunger pangs, having skipped breakfast to secure their emergency wardrobes. They were freezing exhausted and utterly isolated in a soundproof glass box high above the city. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening, and deliberately designed to break them. The psychological pressure finally fractured their fragile alliance. The polite restraint demanded by high society evaporated entirely, leaving only desperate, cornered animals. Edward broke the silence, his voice raspy and shaking from the cold. He dragged a trembling hand down his pale face, stating that once Vanguard transferred the buyout funds, he was immediately seizing total executive control of the newly liquidated assets to rebuild his reputation. He declared that his name was the only thing of value left, and he would dictate exactly how the capital was distributed to salvage his social standing. Carter's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot and frantic, narrowed with vicious hostility. He slammed his fist against the mahogany table, his voice a harsh, venomous bark. He demanded a 60% cut of the buyout capital immediately upon signing. He screamed that his federal defense lawyers required a massive upfront cash retainer by tomorrow morning, or the FBI was going to drag him out of his townhouse in handcuffs. He explicitly told his father that Edward's bruised ego was entirely irrelevant compared to a decade in a federal penitentiary. Edward surged to his feet, ignoring the agonizing cramp in his calves. He roared back, his face inches from his son's, completely abandoning any pretense of paternal affection. He reminded Carter that the only reason the federal government was breathing down their necks was because of Carter's catastrophic incompetence. He spat that Carter was a degenerate gambler who had let a freelance data analyst manipulate their entire financial infrastructure. Edward swore he would not sacrifice the last remaining shreds of his legacy to save a son who had actively destroyed it. Brittany could not take it anymore. The screaming amplified the pounding headache throbbing behind her eyes. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep loudly, her sobs echoing harshly against the glass walls. She gestured wildly at her blistered, bleeding feet and her ruined designer dress. She screamed that she had lost her husband, her home, and her social standing all in a single week. She sobbed that she was freezing to death in a glass box. Her custom shoes were irreparably destroyed from climbing 40 flights of concrete stairs, and she was starving. She demanded that Carter stop arguing and go force the assistants to bring them food and water before she collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Carter sneered at his sister in absolute disgust, but his own physical discomfort overrode his anger. His throat was parched, and the freezing air conditioning was making his muscles seize. He announced that he was going to find the arrogant receptionist, demand immediate service, and threaten the CEO with a walkout if they were not treated with the respect their buyout warranted. He adjusted his damp, wrinkled suit jacket, trying to muster a shred of his former intimidating posture. He marched across the boardroom, his leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the polished floor. He reached the heavy reinforced glass door and grabbed the thick stainless steel handle. He pulled. The door did not move. Carter frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. He planted his feet, gripped the handle with both hands, and yanked backward with all of his remaining strength. The heavy glass did not budge a single millimeter. It was entirely rigid. He pounded his fist against the glass, shouting for someone in the empty hallway to open the door. He rattled the handle violently, pure panic finally beginning to pierce through his arrogant rage. Edward and Brittany fell silent, watching him with widening eyes as the reality of their situation slowly dawned on them. Above the doorframe, a small, discreet LED security light silently shifted from a welcoming green to a solid, impenetrable red. The magnetic locks had engaged. They were securely bolted inside the room from the outside. Before Carter could turn around to voice his rising terror, the sharp hum of the air conditioning abruptly cut off. A split second later, the bright fluorescent overhead lights in the boardroom suddenly dimmed to a low, ominous shadow. The dim emergency shadows of the freezing boardroom offered no comfort to the trapped family. Carter slumped against the frosted glass wall, his teeth chattering violently, his knuckles bruised from pounding on the unyielding door. Brittany was curled into a pathetic shivering ball on the carpet, clutching her ruined designer dress and sobbing quietly into her knees. Edward leaned heavily against the mahogany table, his breathing shallow and ragged, his face a horrifying shade of pale gray. The absolute silence of the room was designed to crush their spirits, and it was working perfectly. Then a sharp, heavy electronic click echoed through the cavernous space. The magnetic lock disengaged. The massive double doors at the far end of the boardroom finally swung open with a smooth, heavy glide. Blinding, brilliant light from the executive corridor flooded the dark room, forcing the three shivering figures to shield their eyes. A squad of 6 towering men marched through the threshold. They wore immaculate jet-black suits, moving with the terrifying synchronized precision of a paramilitary strike team. They fanned out silently, securing the perimeter of the room and completely blocking the only exit. Their faces were carved from stone, projecting an aura of absolute lethal authority. Following close behind them was a man whose very presence commanded immediate, unquestioning submission. It was Vincent. He was a legendary, ruthless Wall Street titan, a man known across the global financial sector for dismantling century-old corporations before breakfast and liquidating their assets for sport. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the light of the room. His icy, predatory gaze swept over the 3 huddled, pathetic figures with utter, terrifying disdain. Edward's eyes bulged. He recognized the Titan immediately. The sheer magnitude of Vincent's presence triggered a primal, desperate survival instinct in the ruined patriarch. Forgetting the freezing temperatures, his extreme exhaustion, and his complete lack of dignity, Edward scrambled up from the floor. He practically crawled across the polished mahogany table, throwing himself forward until he was virtually on his knees at Vincent's expensive leather shoes. He launched into a frantic, groveling pitch. "Mr. Vincent, thank God you are here!" Edward babbled hysterically, his voice cracking with desperation. He desperately tried to sell the illusion of value, his hands shaking as he gestured wildly. "You are making the smartest acquisition of the decade. My commercial real estate empire is prime. We have unparalleled assets, historic market yields, and untouchable corporate leases. Just sign the buyout funds over today, and I swear blind obedience to Vanguard Holdings. You will own the city." Vincent did not even blink. He completely ignored the pathetic sweating man groveling at his feet, treating Edward as if he were nothing more than an unpleasant stain on the marble floor. Vincent stepped effortlessly around the pleading patriarch and walked calmly to the head of the massive conference table. He placed a sleek carbon fiber briefcase on the polished wood and popped the dual silver latches. He reached inside and pulled out a single unlabeled bottle of red wine. Edward's frantic rambling stuttered to a pathetic halt. Carter pushed himself up off the floor, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Brittany stopped sobbing and stared, her mascara-stained face twisting in genuine shock. It was not a celebratory bottle of champagne. It was a very specific, ultra-rare vintage of Bordeaux. It was the exact same vintage Edward had violently poured over Melody's head during a family dinner 5 years ago, the very night he first initiated his ruthless campaign of psychological abuse against her. Vincent retrieved a single crystal glass from a side console. He uncorked the bottle with a swift, practiced motion and poured a generous measure of the dark red liquid. The rich, earthy scent filled the freezing room, a stark, terrifying reminder of past cruelty. Vincent set the bottle down, placed the crystal glass precisely at the center of the table's head setting, and took a respectful step back. He did not look at Edward. He did not look at Carter or Brittany. He simply turned his icy gaze toward the heavy, opaque private executive door adjacent to the glass wall. Vincent clasped his hands behind his back, his posture shifting into one of absolute unwavering deference. His voice boomed through the quiet boardroom. "You can come in now, Madam Chairwoman." The heavy electronic lock on the private door clicked. The heavy wood swung open. Melody walked into the room. She was no longer the submissive, quiet woman they had bullied, humiliated, and discarded. She wore a sharp, custom-tailored crimson power suit that practically radiated absolute control. She did not spare a single glance at the pathetic, shivering family cowering on the floor. She walked with perfect, terrifying composure directly to the head of the mahogany table, pulled out the high-backed leather chair, and sat down. Carter stared at the woman sitting at the head of the polished mahogany table. His brain completely failed to process the image before him. This was Melody, his quiet, submissive, financially dependent wife, the woman he had spent 5 years belittling, controlling, and emotionally starving. Now she was sitting in the throne of Vanguard Holdings, radiating absolute terrifying power. The cognitive dissonance physically broke him. Carter's mouth opened and closed silently before a loud, hysterical sound erupted from his throat. He pointed a violently shaking finger across the length of the table, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged denial. He screamed that she was a psychotic, obsessed stalker. He yelled frantically to Vincent that this crazy woman was his deranged soon-to-be ex-wife and that she must have manipulated a janitor or snuck through the service corridors to get into the building. He desperately commanded the towering security men to grab her physically, throw her out onto the street, and call the police immediately. He ranted, his voice cracking, that she was trying to sabotage the most critical business deal of his life out of sheer pathetic jealousy because she knew he was about to become a billionaire. The 6 security operatives did not move a single muscle. They remained completely still, their eyes locked straight ahead, treating Carter like a ghost. Vincent, the untouchable titan of Wall Street, turned his head slowly. His icy, predatory gaze locked onto the screaming man. He raised his right hand and brought his fist down onto the mahogany table. The impact cracked through the freezing, silent boardroom like a literal gunshot. Edward flinched so hard he nearly collapsed back onto the carpet. Brittany covered her ears, letting out a sharp gasp of terror. Vincent leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His voice was a low, lethal growl that commanded absolute obedience. He explicitly commanded Carter to shut his mouth. He declared that Carter would address the sole heir and chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings with the utmost unquestioning respect, or he would personally see to it that Carter was thrown out of the 40-story window. He called Carter a miserable, delusional parasite who had spent the last 5 years living off the charity of a woman he was too stupid to understand. Edward's jaw went slack. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of white. The billionaire savior he had been praying to, the mythical entity he had bankrupted his entire family to impress, was the very daughter-in-law he had ruthlessly tormented and discarded. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Melody did not say a word. Her expression remained entirely impassive, a mask of calculated, beautiful vengeance. She reached into the pocket of her tailored crimson blazer and retrieved a sleek silver remote control. She aimed it at the far wall and pressed a single button. The massive, opaque glass panels surrounding the boardroom instantly digitized. They transformed into enormous high-definition display screens. The entire room was illuminated by a blinding cascade of financial data, corporate memos, and bank statements. Carter stumbled backward, his eyes darting frantically across the glowing displays. It was his entire professional history. Every single bank account, every performance review, every major transaction he had ever made was plastered across the walls for everyone to see. Melody finally spoke, her voice ringing out crisp and deadly in the freezing air. She instructed him to look closely at his so-called brilliant career. She systematically walked him through the data flashing on the screens. She highlighted his first massive promotion 3 years ago, the one that had supposedly cemented his status as a financial prodigy. She revealed the internal routing numbers, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Vanguard Holdings had secretly orchestrated the promotion. Vanguard had funneled capital into his firm specifically to secure his advancement. She pressed the remote again, changing the slide. It brought up his exorbitant end-of-year bonuses. These were the exact bonuses he had used to buy designer watches, lease luxury sports cars, and fund secret vacations with his mistresses. The screens displayed crystal-clear evidence that those funds did not come from his successful trades or his corporate acumen. They were direct, untraceable wire transfers from Vanguard subsidiary accounts. Melody explicitly broke it down for him. She stated that he had never earned a single dollar of his wealth. He had never been a prodigy, a genius, or even a competent broker. Every success, every promotion, every accolade he had ever received was a carefully manufactured illusion. She had built a protective financial bubble around him to keep him employed and distracted, while she quietly constructed her financial empire in the shadows. He was nothing but a pet project she had funded to keep him out of her way. Carter's legs gave out. He fell hard into one of the leather chairs, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The screens continued to scroll through his entire life, mathematically proving that he was an absolute, unequivocal fraud. Brittany sat frozen, her ruined feet forgotten, staring in pure horror at the sister-in-law she had treated like dirt. Edward clutched his chest, the reality of his complete, unrecoverable destruction finally triggering a visible physical panic attack. Melody stood up slowly from the head of the table. She picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from her desk and walked with measured, authoritative steps toward her trembling ex-husband. She stopped right in front of him, looking down at his pathetic, sweating face. She slid a single, crisp legal document across the table until it rested right against his shaking hands. The heavy embossed Vanguard logo sat at the top of the page. Melody leaned in close, her voice a deadly quiet whisper that echoed through the entire room. She told him that she did not just file for divorce. She informed him that at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Holdings had aggressively purchased the majority voting shares of his investment bank. She was now the sole undisputed owner of the firm he worked for. "You are fired." The heavy, suffocating silence in the freezing boardroom was absolute. Carter sat completely paralyzed in his chair, his jaw hanging slack, the termination document trembling violently in his hands. The sheer magnitude of his complete professional and financial annihilation short-circuited his brain. He had nothing left to say. He was ruined. Edward, however, realized instantly that his son was now entirely useless. The older man tore his frantic, bloodshot eyes away from Carter and locked them directly onto Melody. The ruthless, arrogant patriarch who had once commanded her to scrub floors and endure daily humiliation completely vanished. In his place was a desperate, sweating, cornered animal trying to deploy his very last weapon. Edward swallowed hard, forcing a sickly, sweet, trembling smile onto his pale, mottled face. He dropped to his knees right there on the carpet, clasping his hands together in a gesture of pure, nauseating submission. He played the family card with shameless desperation. He pleaded with Melody to remember the good times they had shared. He brought up past Thanksgiving dinners, completely fabricating a narrative where he had welcomed her into their home with open arms and loved her like his own daughter. He claimed that underneath all the current misunderstandings, they were still a family, and family always protected each other. He leaned his weight against the edge of the mahogany table, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the polished wood. He desperately pitched his commercial real estate firm one final time, offering to completely betray his own son to save himself. He begged her to look past Carter's foolish mistakes and execute the buyout of his company. He promised to hand over the entire board of directors, surrender all his voting rights, and walk away quietly if she would just authorize the Vanguard capital transfer to save him from total ruin. Melody stared down at the groveling man. Then she laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was a sharp, piercing laugh that echoed off the digital glass walls, entirely devoid of amusement or mercy. The sound sliced through Edward's fake warmth like a razor blade. Melody reached her hand back into the thick, leather-bound folder resting on the desk in front of her. She pulled out a heavy stack of legal paperwork and tossed it casually across the table. The document slid over the smooth surface and stopped inches from Edward's trembling hands. He looked down. They were the fraudulent mortgage documents he had secretly drafted months ago. The exact same forged paperwork he had used to try and illegally seize ownership of her Brooklyn brownstone. Melody leaned forward, her voice laced with absolute terrifying control. "You tried to steal a house I bought in cash, Edward. Did you really think I wouldn't audit your company?" Edward recoiled as if the papers had physically burned him. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. Vincent remained standing by the door like a stone sentinel, his arms crossed, watching the execution unfold with grim satisfaction. The 6 security guards did not flinch. Melody picked up the silver remote control and pressed a button. The towering glass walls around them shifted instantly. Carter's pathetic banking history vanished, replaced immediately by massive, highly complex financial ledgers. Edward's breath hitched violently in his throat. It was the internal accounting architecture of his entire commercial real estate empire laid bare for the room to see. Melody did not hold back. She methodically dismantled his life's work. She pointed to the glowing red figures on the screens, explicitly detailing the massive systemic fraud he had been running for over a decade. She exposed the phantom shell companies he had created in the Cayman Islands to hide his mounting debts. She highlighted the grossly inflated property appraisals he had used to secure fraudulent bank loans. She laid out his double bookkeeping practices with surgical precision, showing exactly how he had funneled millions of dollars into offshore accounts to avoid paying federal corporate taxes. She spoke with the ruthless authority of a true corporate predator. She informed Edward that Vanguard Holdings did not acquire toxic, debt-ridden liabilities. She stated clearly that his real estate firm was completely worthless. It was nothing but a fragile house of cards built entirely on federal crimes, and she had just kicked the table. Edward gasped for air, his hands clutching at the collar of his bespoke Italian suit, as if the expensive silk were choking him. He stuttered, trying to formulate a defense, trying to stammer out a lie, claiming the numbers were a mistake, or a clerical error made by an incompetent accountant. Melody cut him off completely. She lowered her voice to a deadly icy register. She revealed that she had not just audited his company for a potential acquisition. She had personally compiled every single forged signature, every hidden ledger, and every trace of multi-million-dollar tax evasion. She had packaged the entire mountain of evidence into a neat, undeniable federal dossier. Edward stared at her, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated horror, as the realization finally hit him. He was not getting a corporate buyout. He was getting a criminal indictment. Melody explicitly confirmed his worst fear. She announced that she had forwarded the entire comprehensive audit directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the federal prosecutor's office 48 hours ago. She told him that the authorities had been incredibly grateful for the anonymous tip, especially since it came with a perfect, undeniable paper trail of federal tax evasion and wire fraud. Brittany let out a high, terrified shriek, pressing her hands over her mouth as tears ruined her expensive makeup. Carter remained slumped in his chair, completely catatonic. his mind unable to process the sheer scale of their defeat. Edward staggered backward, his knees knocking against the heavy leather chair behind him. He clutched his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow. The sheer terror of spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary was physically crushing his lungs. Then, a new sound pierced the dead silence of the freezing boardroom. Faint at first, but growing rapidly louder, the piercing wail of police sirens echoed up from the chaotic Manhattan streets below. The sound vibrated through the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows, multiplying in intensity as multiple squad cars converged on the plaza of the Vanguard Holdings skyscraper. The red and blue emergency lights reflected faintly against the glass of the towering building. Melody sat back in her chair. She crossed her arms, listening to the approaching sirens with a look of absolute profound satisfaction. She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a perfectly calm, chilling whisper. Right on time. The wail of the approaching sirens vibrated through the floorboards, a relentless mechanical scream signaling the absolute end of the family dynasty. Edward remained on his knees, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged, pathetic wheezes as he stared up at the digital screens displaying his federal tax crimes. Carter sat frozen in his chair, completely unresponsive to the reality that his entire life was a manufactured illusion. Suddenly, the heavy electronic lock on the primary corridor door flashed a harsh green. The massive mahogany panels were violently shoved open. Two Vanguard security operatives marched into the freezing boardroom. Between them, they dragged a thrashing, hysterical Brittany. She had slipped out to the executive washroom moments before Vincent had initiated the total floor lockdown, entirely missing the catastrophic sequence of events that had just dismantled her father and brother. Now she was forcefully deposited onto the boardroom carpet. She stumbled forward, her face contorted in a mask of pure, privileged rage. She wildly waved a useless platinum credit card in the air, her voice screeching over the distant sirens. She demanded to know what was going on. She screamed that she had just tried to buy a simple bottle of water from the VIP lounge downstairs, and her card had been declined. She pulled out her phone, frantically tapping the screen, yelling that her banking app was locked, her trust fund access was revoked, and all of her personal accounts were completely frozen. She stomped her foot, ordering Carter to stop playing games and fix her finances immediately. Her shrill demands hung in the freezing air. Nobody moved. Brittany finally stopped yelling. She lowered her phone and actually looked around the room. The sight before her completely short-circuited her brain. Her invincible father was groveling on the floor, sweating through his custom suit. Her arrogant brother was staring blankly at the wall like a lobotomized patient. And sitting at the head of the conference table, entirely unbothered by the chaos, was Melody. The woman Brittany had spent years tormenting was currently holding court in the highest seat of power, surrounded by elite security. Before Brittany could even formulate a question, the shadows at the back of the cavernous boardroom shifted. A man stepped forward into the harsh glowing light of the digitized financial screens. It was DeAndre. Brittany gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock. This was not the exhausted, disrespected man she had belittled and discarded. DeAndre stood tall, his posture radiating quiet, lethal confidence. He was dressed in an immaculate, custom-tailored navy suit that fit him perfectly, the fabric absorbing the harsh light of the room. He held a sleek carbon fiber clipboard in one hand, calmly tapping a platinum pen against its edge. He looked at Brittany with the clinical, detached observation of a scientist examining a deeply unpleasant specimen. Melody did not even turn her head. She kept her eyes locked on Edward as she spoke, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. She announced that Vanguard Holdings was expanding its portfolio. She declared the immediate launch of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare and medical research division. She then formally introduced DeAndre to the room, officially appointing him as the chief medical director of the entire global sector. She stated clearly that DeAndre now commanded unlimited resources, executive control over dozens of research hospitals, and a personal compensation package that eclipsed Edward's entire net worth. Brittany stood paralyzed on the carpet. Her greedy, calculating brain rapidly processed the new reality. Carter was a fired, penniless fraud. Her father was seconds away from being arrested by the federal agents currently swarming the lobby. Her own bank accounts were completely drained. She had absolutely nothing left. But DeAndre, the husband she had treated like a disposable accessory, was now standing at the absolute pinnacle of wealth and power. Survival instinct kicked in. Brittany instantly shifted gears. The rage vanished from her face, immediately replaced by a mask of manufactured desperate sorrow. She dropped her frozen credit cards onto the floor. Tears welled up in her eyes as she let out a loud, dramatic sob. She stumbled across the room, rushing directly toward DeAndre with her arms outstretched. She launched into a frantic, groveling apology. She cried that she had made a terrible mistake. She claimed that Edward and Carter had manipulated her, pressured her into filing the paperwork, and poisoned her mind against him. She swore that she had always loved him, that he was the only good thing in her life, and that they could finally start over now that the toxic influence of her family was gone. She pleaded with him to take her back, to protect her, to let her be his wife again. DeAndre watched her approach. His expression did not change. There was no anger, no sadness, and absolutely no mercy in his eyes. As Brittany lunged forward to throw her arms around his neck, DeAndre effortlessly took a single step to the side. Brittany stumbled past him, her hands grasping empty air. She lost her balance and crashed awkwardly against the digital glass wall, sliding down slightly as her desperate momentum betrayed her. DeAndre did not look back at her. He calmly looked down at his sleek clipboard, clicked his platinum pen, and made a single precise checkmark on the top page. His voice was perfectly even, entirely devoid of emotion. "The divorce was finalized an hour ago, Brittany. I took the dog too." Brittany collapsed completely onto the floor. Her hysterical sobs muffled against the expensive carpet as the reality of losing DeAndre and his newly minted billionaire status crushed her. She clutched her deactivated credit cards, weeping over her lost luxury and vanished social standing. Melody did not spare her former sister-in-law a single glance. She turned her full, terrifying attention back to the ruined men sitting at the table. Melody snapped her fingers. Vincent stepped forward with military precision and placed a thick, ominous stack of legal documents directly in the center of the mahogany table. Melody slid a heavy silver pen across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of Edward. She announced her final offer. It was a total, unconditional asset surrender. Melody laid out the brutal terms with surgical precision. To cover the massive fraudulent debts Edward had hidden within his real estate company Vanguard Holdings was officially seizing everything. She demanded the deeds to their personal estates, the titles to their luxury vehicles, the keys to their summer homes, and total access to their offshore emergency funds. Every single penny they possessed would be liquidated immediately. Edward gasped, clutching his chest, begging for mercy, but Melody held up her phone. She told him he had exactly 60 seconds to sign the surrender. If he signed away everything he owned right now, she would make one phone call to halt the FBI raid on his personal estate. She offered to spare his elderly parents from the sheer terror of watching armed federal agents tear their home apart. If he refused, the federal indictment would hit his personal life just as hard as his corporate one. Edward reached for the silver pen with a violently shaking hand, thoroughly broken and ready to surrender everything to save his parents. Before the pen could touch the paper, Carter slammed his fist down onto the table, snatching the contract away. The younger man pushed himself up from his chair, his face flushed with a desperate, manic rage. He screamed that he would absolutely never sign away his life. He pointed a hostile finger at Melody, declaring that she was completely out of her mind if she thought she could leave him with nothing. Carter loudly proclaimed his legal rights. He yelled that they were legally married, which meant he was fully entitled to exactly half of her billionaire fortune. He threatened to drag her through the most vicious, highly publicized divorce in the history of Manhattan. He boasted that he would hire a ruthless team of aggressive divorce attorneys to dismantle Vanguard Holdings piece by piece until he got his 50%. He stood tall, a smug, arrogant grin returning to his sweaty face, firmly believing he had just played an unbeatable trump card. He told Melody she was trapped by her own marriage license and that her little revenge plot was about to make him richer than he had ever dreamed. Melody did not flinch. She simply smiled a cold, calculating smile. The heavy wooden door leading to the executive corridor swung open. A woman stepped into the freezing boardroom holding a single age-yellowed folder. Carter's smug grin vanished instantly. He recognized her immediately. It was the woman he had aggressively belittled and dismissed as a lowly, incompetent receptionist when he first arrived at the building. She was no longer wearing a modest blazer. She was dressed in a sharp, intimidating designer suit that projected absolute authority. The woman walked directly to the table and introduced herself properly as the chief legal officer of Vanguard Holdings. She looked at Carter with the exact same disdain he had shown her hours earlier. She opened her folder and dropped a single legal document right on top of the asset surrender contract. She instructed Carter to read his own signature. The chief legal officer laid out the brutal truth with flawless legal precision. She reminded Carter of a specific night 5 years ago, exactly 1 week before their wedding. She recounted how Melody had handed him a stack of papers, claiming she had massive, crippling student debt from her university days. Carter had been so incredibly greedy, so utterly terrified of being held responsible for a single dollar of his future wife's fabricated poverty, that he had eagerly signed the papers without consulting a single lawyer. He thought he was signing a standard liability waiver to protect his own trust fund. The chief legal officer tapped the document with a manicured finger. She announced that it was actually a globally recognized ironclad asset protection prenuptial agreement. It explicitly stated that Carter forfeited any and all rights to Melody's current corporate assets, future earnings, and inherited wealth. He had willingly signed away his marital rights to save himself from a debt that never existed. Carter stared down at the paper. His own signature stared back at him in black ink. He read the dense, flawless legal jargon outlining his complete financial isolation. His brain finally processed the reality of his situation. He had absolutely zero legal claim to a single penny of the Vanguard empire. He would leave this building with nothing but the clothes on his back. The absolute finality of his ruin struck him, causing his knees to buckle as he collapsed heavily back into his chair, gasping for air. Suddenly, Vincent pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece, his face turning entirely serious. The wailing sirens on the street below abruptly cut off. A heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed up from the building's central elevator shafts. Vincent looked directly at Melody, his voice cutting through the silent panic of the room. He announced that the police and federal agents had just breached the Vanguard lobby downstairs and were currently securing the building. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the pristine marble corridors outside the boardroom. The private elevator banks chimed in rapid, synchronized succession. Federal agents and local police units had reached the 40th floor. The sheer, terrifying reality of the approaching footsteps broke the very last remaining shred of Edward's resolve. The older man let out a wretched, uncontrollable sob that tore through his chest. Tears streamed down his pale, mottled cheeks, dripping onto the pristine mahogany table. He lunged forward, grabbing the heavy silver pen Melody had provided. His hand shook violently, the nib tearing slightly at the thick parchment as he scrawled his signature across the asset surrender documents. He did not read the clauses. He did not care about the fine print. He was signing away his commercial real estate empire, his luxury vehicles, the sprawling family estates, and every offshore account he possessed. He traded his entire dynasty, the legacy he had built over 40 years, for a guarantee that he would not die in a federal penitentiary. Vincent stepped forward, instantly snatching the signed documents from the table with cold, mechanical efficiency. The transaction was complete. The family was officially destitute. Carter watched his father sign away the very last drop of their wealth. The safety net was gone. The offshore trust funds were evaporated. The ironclad prenuptial agreement had already stripped him of any claim to Melody's billions. He was a man suspended over a terrifying financial abyss, and gravity was finally taking hold. The arrogant, ruthless broker who had tormented Melody for 5 years completely disintegrated. Carter dropped heavily to his knees. The sharp impact against the floorboards went entirely ignored as pure, unadulterated panic consumed his mind. He began to crawl. He dragged his expensive designer suit across the boardroom carpet, inching his way desperately toward the woman he had treated as a disposable servant. He reached the toe of Melody's crimson heel and looked up, his face slick with sweat and tears. He begged her for mercy. His voice was a high, pathetic whine echoing off the digital glass walls that still displayed his fraudulent bank records. He pleaded with her to tear up the prenuptial agreement, to give him a lucrative executive position at Vanguard Holdings, to let him stay in their sprawling penthouse. He wildly claimed that everything he had done over the past 5 years was a terrible misunderstanding. He cried that the intense pressure of his financial career had broken his mind, that he was just incredibly stressed, and that he had always truly loved her. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of her tailored blazer, whining that they could start over, that he would be the perfect, obedient, loving husband if she just gave him one more chance to prove his worth. Melody did not recoil. She looked down at the weeping, crawling man at her feet with an expression of absolute, terrifying boredom. She took a single deliberate step back, forcing Carter to stretch further, just to keep her in his line of sight. Outside the glass walls, the silhouettes of heavily armed federal agents moved swiftly through the executive lobby, securing the perimeter with shouted commands and the crackle of two-way radios. The net was closing in entirely. Melody leaned down. She lowered her face until she was mere inches from Carter's ear, ensuring that her words were meant for him, and him alone. Her voice was a chilling, perfectly controlled whisper that cut through his frantic, pathetic sobbing. She reminded him of the hospital charity gala 3 years ago. She painted the vivid picture of the grand ballroom, the flashing cameras, and the elite crowd of Manhattan's wealthiest socialites. She reminded him of the exact moment he had lost his temper over a spilled cocktail on his jacket. She recounted in vivid detail how he had raised his hand and slapped her across the face with all his might in front of 500 people, leaving her bruised, bleeding, and humiliated on the cold marble floor. She repeated the exact words he had spat at her while the entire room watched in stunned silence. "You slapped me in front of 500 people," Melody whispered, her voice colder than the freezing air of the boardroom. "You told me I belonged in the gutter." Carter froze. The breath hitched violently in his throat as the memory of his own horrific cruelty was thrown back at him. The hollow excuses died on his tongue. He stared into Melody's eyes, desperately searching for a single ounce of hesitation, a fleeting glimmer of the submissive, terrified wife he had controlled for half a decade. He found nothing but a vast, frozen wasteland. Melody stood up straight. She reached onto the polished mahogany table and picked up the incredibly thick, heavy stack of legal documents left behind by the chief legal officer. It was the finalized ironclad divorce decree mixed with the total personal bankruptcy filings for the entire family. She gripped the massive stack of paper tightly in her right hand. She pulled her arm back and swung with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy stack of documents slapped viciously across Carter's face. The sharp, explosive crack echoed like a whip through the silent boardroom. The sheer physical force of the blow knocked Carter sideways, sending him sprawling across the carpet. The binding snapped, and crisp white pages containing his total financial ruin scattered into the air, fluttering down around his cowering body like snow. Melody looked down at the ruined man, her voice ringing out with absolute finality as the boardroom doors burst open behind her. "Consider this my RSVP." The heavy mahogany doors of the 40th floor boardroom did not simply open. They were thrust apart with overwhelming militaristic force. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets flooded the space, moving with synchronized, terrifying efficiency. Uniformed officers from the New York Police Department flanked them instantly, securing every exit and locking down the perimeter. The suffocating tension of the corporate standoff evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp, chaotic reality of a full-scale criminal takedown. Radios crackled with clipped authoritative commands. The agents bypassed Edward entirely, moving with clear, predetermined targets in mind. They formed a tight, impenetrable ring around the conference table, entirely cutting off any potential route of escape. Two towering federal agents stepped directly behind Carter. The younger man was still sprawled on the carpet, where Melody's heavy stack of finalized divorce papers had struck him. He stared up at the agents with wide, bloodshot eyes, his chest heaving as he scrambled backward like a cornered animal trying to escape a predator. A stern-faced lead agent reached down, grabbed Carter by the collar of his ruined bespoke suit, and hauled him roughly to his feet. Before Carter could even stammer out a protest or attempt to negotiate, his arms were forcefully wrenched behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the freezing room, sounding like a vault door slamming shut on his entire future. The lead agent did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He looked Carter dead in the eye and began reciting his Miranda rights with cold, practiced precision. He explicitly informed Carter that he was being placed under immediate federal arrest for multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, aggravated wire fraud, and systemic conspiracy to defraud federal financial institutions. The agent listed the severe charges like a judge handing down a death sentence, ensuring every single syllable landed with absolute finality. Carter thrashed violently against the steel cuffs. The sheer terror of spending the next 3 decades in a maximum security penitentiary finally broke his fragile mind. He screamed that there was a massive mistake, that he was the real victim, and that Melody had illegally set him up. The agents ignored his frantic, pathetic babbling. They tightened their grip on his arms and prepared to march him out of the building. Desperation stripped away the very last shred of Carter's manufactured pride. He twisted his neck, his frantic eyes searching the room until they locked onto Edward. The older man was still clutching the edge of the mahogany table, entirely focused on the asset surrender document he had just signed to save his own skin. Carter shrieked for his father. He begged the patriarch to call their army of corporate lawyers, to use his vast political connections, to do absolutely anything to stop the federal agents from taking him away. He cried out that they were family, that they always protected each other against outsiders, and that he could not possibly survive in a federal prison. Edward slowly lifted his head. The ruthless, calculating patriarch looked at his handcuffed, sobbing son. Then, in the ultimate display of the toxic, self-serving rot that infected their entire bloodline, Edward simply turned his back. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He did not make a single phone call. He stood facing the digital glass wall, clutching his immunity deal, entirely willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to ensure he did not share a neighboring cell block. He had traded his son for his own freedom without a second of hesitation. Carter let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure betrayal. The sound tore from his throat as the agents forcefully marched him toward the exit, his cries echoing down the marble hallway. As Carter was dragged through the doorway, the chaos shifted to the far wall. 2 Vanguard security operatives were currently hauling Brittany to her feet. She had witnessed her brother's brutal arrest and her father's ultimate betrayal in stunned, horrified silence. Now it was her turn to be discarded from the premises. A female security officer shoved a cheap standard-issue cardboard box into Brittany's chest. It contained the pathetic remnants of her brief, fraudulent tenure at the company, including a few designer pens, a shattered vanity mirror, and her permanently revoked building access badge. Brittany slapped the box away, sending the items crashing to the floor, but the guards simply grabbed her by the arms and began marching her out of the boardroom. The initial shock wore off instantly, replaced by unhinged, privileged fury. She thrashed wildly against the guards, screaming vicious obscenities at the top of her lungs. She hurled deeply personal insults at Melody, cursed DeAndre for his newfound billionaire status, and threatened to ruin everyone in the building with lawsuits she could no longer afford. Her shrill, manic screaming echoed down the pristine marble corridor, completely lacking any dignity or grace. The security operatives did not slow down or acknowledge her threats. They frog-marched her directly into the waiting service elevator and shoved her inside without ceremony. Brittany continued her hysterical, expletive-laced tirade, her face purple with rage, fighting against the guards, until the heavy steel doors finally slid shut, cutting off her voice completely. The federal agents escorted Edward out moments later. He walked with a hollow, shuffling gait, entirely stripped of his companies, his properties, and his dignity. He was technically a free man, but he was leaving the building with absolutely nothing left to live for. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind the last departing police officer. The wailing sirens on the street below began to fade, moving further and further away toward the downtown federal holding facility. The deafening chaos vanished instantly, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence in its wake. The harsh glare of the digital financial screens illuminated the empty space where the most arrogant family in Manhattan had just been systematically dismantled and destroyed. Melody stood perfectly still at the head of the polished conference table. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the toxic weight of the past 5 years completely lift from her shoulders. She turned around to face the back of the room. DeAndre stood quietly by the glass wall, a look of profound respect and vindication in his eyes. Beside him stood an older man with kind, weathered eyes and a posture of quiet strength, her father, the man who had secretly guided and supported her through the darkest years of her life. Melody looked at the two men who had stood by her when she had nothing. A genuine, radiant smile finally broke across her face. The war was officially over. The sharp, deafening crack of a wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot through the sterile, freezing air of the federal courthouse. Carter stood before the towering judge's bench, his posture violently trembling. The bespoke Italian suit he had worn to the Vanguard boardroom was now severely wrinkled, stained with cold sweat, and reeking of the desperate fear that permeated the holding cells downstairs. He frantically scanned the crowded gallery behind him, his bloodshot eyes darting back and forth, desperately searching for the army of high-priced, ruthless defense attorneys his father had always promised would be there to save him. The wooden benches reserved for the defense were entirely empty. He had been completely abandoned. The federal prosecutor, a woman with eyes like chipped ice, did not mince her words. She stood tall at her podium and laid out a staggering, undeniable paper trail of catastrophic corporate embezzlement, offshore tax evasion, and systemic wire fraud. She explicitly labeled Carter a severe, unmanageable flight risk with a documented history of manipulating financial institutions. Carter gripped the wooden railing in front of him, his knuckles turning white. He desperately tried to deploy his signature arrogant charm, stammering out a pathetic, trembling excuse about clerical accounting errors and claiming he was merely a victim of corporate misunderstandings. The judge cut him off instantly. Her voice left absolutely zero room for negotiation. Bail was unequivocally denied. Carter let out a strangled, breathless gasp as two massive federal marshals grabbed his arms, forcefully wrenching them behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into his skin. The former corporate kingpin who had built his entire identity on the illusion of untouchable power was officially a federal inmate. He was stripped of his title, his fabricated wealth, and his freedom marched out of the courtroom toward a waiting transport van to begin a sentence that would likely span 3 decades. 40 miles away, in a highly exclusive Connecticut suburb, the final humiliating act of Edward's destruction was playing out on his own manicured lawn. A fleet of massive, rumbling, moving trucks idled in the sprawling driveway, completely blocking the ornate wrought iron gates. These were not the meticulous white-glove art handlers Edward was accustomed to hiring for his estate. They were rough, impatient foreclosure contractors executing a ruthless federal seizure mandated by the Vanguard bankruptcy filings. Edward stood alone on the curb, his shoulders completely hunched, his face pale and hollow. He clutched a single thin plastic trash bag containing his remaining clothes. He watched in silent, paralyzed horror as the contractors physically hauled his prized possessions out the massive double doors. They did not carry the items. They hurled them. A massive, gaudy, fake gold chandelier crashed onto the paved driveway, shattering into 1,000 cheap plastic pieces. Oversized, tacky velvet chairs were tossed carelessly onto the pristine grass. 2 repo men hooked heavy chains to the axles of his leased luxury sedans, dragging them roughly onto flatbed tow trucks. The ruthless patriarch was forced to stand there under the glaring sun, watching his entire fabricated life reduced to a pile of garbage on the lawn, while his wealthy neighbors peered through their blinds, whispering and pointing. It was a perfect, poetic mirror of the exact moment Carter had thrown Melody's belongings into the freezing street years ago. The universe had delivered its absolute unforgiving justice. The humiliation extended far beyond the federal courts and foreclosed mansions. At the incredibly exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club, the morning brunch crowd was already gathering on the sunlit terrace, sipping expensive champagne. Brittany stood trembling violently at the rusted metal door of the employee service entrance. She was not wearing her usual custom silk sundress or carrying a limited edition designer handbag. She wore a severely outdated faded cotton dress she had purchased with the very last crumpled bills she had scrounged from the pockets of her winter coats. She swallowed her immense suffocating pride and walked into the cramped windowless office of the club manager. This was a man she had routinely screamed at, belittled, and threatened to fire over a slightly warm mimosa or an improperly folded napkin. Now he sat behind his heavy oak desk, watching her squirm with a cold, deeply satisfied smile. He did not offer her a seat. He simply slid a heavy industrial mop bucket schedule and a rough, scratchy polyester uniform across the desk. He informed her slowly and deliberately that she would be scrubbing the women's locker room toilets, starting immediately, and she would be doing it for minimum wage. He demanded she verbally agree to the terms. Brittany bit her lip so hard it bled, tears of absolute humiliation stinging her eyes as she forced herself to nod and accept the uniform. The arrogant socialite who had terrorized the elite was now their janitor, forced to clean up their messes just to survive. The absolute destruction of the family was not a private affair. It was the premier entertainment event of the financial world. Across Manhattan, every massive flat-screen television on the Wall Street trading floors flashed the same bold breaking news banner. The glowing red headline read, "The Fall of a Fake Empire." A prominent, sharp-tongued financial anchor meticulously dismantled the family's legacy on live television. The broadcast featured brutal high-definition drone footage of Edward's humiliating eviction, playing right alongside incredibly unflattering wide-eyed mugshots of Carter in federal custody. Elite financial analysts openly mocked the family's amateur reckless shell companies, laughing at the sheer fragility of their massive fraud. The high society circles that Edward Carter and Brittany had desperately clawed their way into watched the broadcast with ruthless amusement, sipping their lattes while completely erasing the family from their contact lists. The social execution was absolute, public, and entirely permanent. They were toxic pariahs, permanently exiled from the world they had worshipped. High above the chaotic city streets, inside the soundproof, bulletproof walls of the Vanguard Holdings executive penthouse, Melody sat on a plush leather sofa. The morning sun illuminated the sprawling Manhattan skyline, stretching out endlessly below her feet. She took a slow, deliberate sip of perfectly brewed black coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. She picked up a heavy silver remote and pressed a single button, instantly muting the massive television screen mounted on the marble wall, cutting off the news anchor's voice mid-sentence. The quiet in the penthouse was absolute, profound, and deeply satisfying. She placed the remote down her eyes, scanning the vast horizon she now completely controlled. Suddenly, the secure, heavily encrypted phone resting on the glass coffee table buzzed. The heavy vibration shattered the perfect silence. Melody leaned forward and picked it up, glancing at the glowing caller ID. The encrypted signature belonged to a massive, highly secretive international investment syndicate based out of Geneva. They were calling to speak directly to the new undisputed head of Vanguard Holdings. Melody smiled, her eyes flashing with renewed, razor-sharp ambition as she swiped the screen to answer the call. 6 months had passed since the spectacular televised disintegration of the Carter dynasty. The toxic remnants of their fraudulent empire had been entirely scrubbed from the city's financial ecosystem, leaving behind a clean slate. The suffocating manufactured tension that had defined Melody's existence was completely gone. In its place stood a night of genuine, unadulterated triumph. The grand opening of the DeAndre Vanguard Medical Wing at Manhattan's most prestigious research hospital was the most coveted invitation of the season. Unlike the garish, self-congratulatory anniversary galas Edward used to throw to mask his crumbling finances, this event radiated quiet, purposeful power. The soaring glass atrium was filled with the soft clinking of crystal flutes and the low hum of intelligent conversation. The guest list was not padded with sycophants and grifters. It was packed with the city's true elite, brilliant neurosurgeons, international philanthropists, and global tech innovators. At the front of the magnificent hall, DeAndre stepped up to the transparent acrylic podium. He was a man completely reborn, dressed in a pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo that perfectly framed his broad shoulders. He looked absolutely nothing like the exhausted, financially drowning man who used to sweep hospital floors just to afford basic medical treatments. The heavy lines of stress and chronic pain had vanished from his face, replaced by a vibrant, commanding glow of health. He tapped the microphone instantly, drawing the rapt attention of 500 esteemed guests. 6 months ago, I was a ghost in this very hospital. DeAndre began, his deep voice echoing flawlessly through the silent atrium. I was a man staring into the terrifying abyss of a healthcare system I could not afford, fighting a battle I was mathematically guaranteed to lose. Today, we open a state-of-the-art facility equipped with a fully funded endowment. This wing guarantees that no family will ever again have to choose between financial ruin and saving the life of someone they love. He paused, gripping the edges of the podium as a wave of profound emotion washed over his features. He directed his gaze straight into the center of the packed ballroom. But I did not build this, DeAndre continued, his voice thick with raw gratitude. I am merely the beneficiary of a miracle. This entire wing, this foundation, and my very life exist today because of the unparalleled brilliance, the strategic genius, and the fiercely loyal heart of one specific woman. She fought a war in the shadows to protect the people she loved, and she won. The brilliant spotlight shifted smoothly across the room, illuminating Melody. She did not flinch. She did not shrink back, lower her gaze, or attempt to blend into the wallpaper, as she had been violently conditioned to do for half a decade. She stood perfectly straight, owning every single inch of the space she occupied. She was an absolute vision of power and grace, dressed in a striking emerald green silk evening gown that caught the ambient light with every fluid movement. Her posture radiated pure, undeniable authority. The submissive, frumpy wife, who used to scrub baseboards in the penthouse, was dead and buried. The true heir to the Vanguard Empire had finally stepped into the light. Melody absorbed the thunderous, deafening applause of the crowd. These were global leaders who genuinely respected her intellect and character, completely validating her existence. She smiled warmly at DeAndre, raising her crystal glass of champagne in a silent, deeply meaningful toast. She was finally unapologetically herself. As the applause gradually subsided and the string quartet resumed playing a soft classical melody, Vincent materialized quietly beside her. The older man looked remarkably at peace. The heavy protective armor of corporate warfare he had worn for decades seemed to have melted away. He stood beside his daughter, watching her command the respect of the room, his eyes shining with overwhelming, unrestrained pride. You look magnificent, my dear, Vincent murmured, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the gala. I feel magnificent, Dad, Melody replied, turning to face the man who had secretly anchored her through the darkest years of her life. Vincent reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. His weathered hand emerged holding a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. This was no ordinary writing instrument. It was the legendary Vanguard chairman's pen. It was the exact pen Vincent had used to sign the founding documents of his empire 40 years ago, the physical manifestation of supreme unchecked authority over their sprawling global syndicate. He reached out gently, took Melody's hand, and pressed the cold, heavy gold metal firmly into her palm. He folded her elegant fingers over the barrel, locking it into her grasp. I am done, Melody, Vincent whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unwavering certainty. The board has been notified. My retirement is effective immediately. I spent my life building a fortress to protect you, but I see now that you never needed a fortress. You needed a throne. The Vanguard Empire, every subsidiary, every global asset, and every seat at the table is now officially and legally yours. Melody looked down at the gleaming gold pen resting heavily in her hand. The sheer magnitude of the moment settled into her bones. She was no longer just the secret weapon operating behind the scenes. She was the undisputed chairman. She looked up and slowly surveyed the magnificent ballroom. She saw DeAndre laughing easily with a group of top-tier medical researchers. She saw her father smiling broadly as he greeted old friends he hadn't seen in years. She was surrounded by a fiercely loyal, incredibly brilliant network of people who valued her mind, her strength, and her character. She was completely, permanently free from the parasitic leeches of her past. A senior Vanguard executive stepped out from the crowd and approached her with respectful urgency. He presented a thick, leather-bound portfolio, opening it to reveal a stack of highly classified legal documents. It was the finalized paperwork for their newest multi-billion-dollar international acquisition, the massive European banking deal she had initiated from her penthouse 6 months prior. Melody did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She uncapped the golden chairman's pen. She leaned gracefully over a high-top cocktail table, the emerald silk of her gown cascading around her, and scrawled her signature across the dotted line with swift, commanding strokes. She snapped the portfolio shut, handed it back to the executive with a sharp nod, and took a slow sip of her champagne. She looked out at the glittering lights of the city skyline visible through the glass walls. The past was completely erased, and the new empire belonged entirely to her. The most profound lesson from these stories of betrayal is that your value is never determined by the people who consistently underestimate you, even if they are your own family. True security and self-worth come from within. When the people meant to protect you instead tear you down, it forces you to build your own unshakable foundation. Independence is your greatest armor against manipulation. You do not need to shrink yourself to fit into a toxic family narrative. Channel that pain into forging your own success. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to find your true worth? Please share your story and comment below.